So welcome everybody. My name is Hannah Wallace and I am the Educational Programming Manager for the African American Museum in Philadelphia. I'm joined today by Alisa, Rashid, and Carolyn Marie Singleton, who will be facilitating today's discussion. So they will be asking Mr. Norris a few questions to begin.
Thank you, Zach, and of course, thank you, Alisa, Carolyn, and our docents, and all of our AAMP family for being here this evening. I just wanted to say a quick word, and Alisa and Carolyn will do the real introductions. But I want to let the docents know I greatly appreciate all of the things that you do and put together to try to educate yourselves and educate our community. You know, through events like these, and also just by equipping yourself to engage people wherever you meet them throughout your life to talk about AMP. It's great going to meetings for other coalitions and other organizations and seeing some of you there, and knowing that, you know, we've got somebody in the room, but also they've got somebody great in the room. So I really appreciate the way you guys bring things together and come together on AMP's behalf. We brought Zach Norris, who's a friend of mine from college, but also someone I greatly respect, and in no small measure due to reading this book of his. Already respected Zach, but to see so much of his personality and his education and experience crystallized into a document is remarkable. And so I'm proud to have him here with you this evening, Harvard 99 in the house. But, you know, when we brought Zach earlier this year, right before we shut down, everything that he's talking about in this book was, you know, in an uncanny way, you know, relevant to the moment. And I mean, it was relevant when he wrote it, but everything that he was talking about was just reaching a fever pitch. And we haven't looked back. It's only gotten louder and louder. So here's a person who's written in advance of this moment, but perhaps a guidebook through this moment, written about systemic racism, about bringing equity in healthcare and housing and education, living wage jobs, fighting the effects and changing the patterns of aggressive policing, along with mass incarceration, among other things. In this aptly named book, We Keep Us Safe. And so I think it's entirely appropriate to bring Zach back to finish our conversation with him in a sense, but also to kick off the season where we bring the exhibition Rendering Justice to audiences as far as we can. An exhibition put together in partnership with the Mural Arts Program, and that explores works of art produced by some formerly incarcerated artists, all of them justice involved or justice impacted, which is of course one of the topics that Zach covers. So this is why we still do it. This is how we will dig ourselves and our communities out of the hole that we're in right now. And there's no better group of people with whom to do it. So with that, I'll hand it off to Alisa and Carolyn. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to Ivan. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ivan.
Yes, indeed. Well, welcome again to our book club meeting here at the African American Museum. My name is Alisa Rashid. I'm the co-facilitator. And Carolyn.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you.
That's right. So as you already know, this month's book selection is We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities by Mr. Zach Norris. In his book, Zach creates a blueprint of how to hold people accountable while holding them in community by reimagining how we define safety and fear and how it has led to problems we face in our communities. So let me tell you a little bit about Zach, because he's all over. So Zach is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and the co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that aims to empower Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and their families. Zach is also the co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. During the 7 years he led the campaign, Books, Not Bars, built California's first statewide network for families of incarcerated youth, which is a lot, led the effort to close 5 youth prisons in California. You need to be commended. He helped pass legislation to enable families to stay in contact with their loved ones and defeat Prop 6, a destructive and ineffective criminal justice ballot measures. So he graduated from Harvard University and took his law degree from New York University. He's married to Sarah Monti. I hope I got her name right. Who is
Sarah Monti.
Yes, indeed. Also an attorney, author, and activist. And they have 2 children. So you can see this whole notion of activism runs in the family. So welcome, Zach, to our book club. And thank you again for coming back to discuss your book.
Thank you.
Challenges us to think about this whole notion of we keep us safe. When I first seen that title, it hit me like 2 bricks. Like, what are you doing to keep your community safe? So, Zach, so much has changed since you were here in March. So how are you?
I'm doing okay. First of all, you'll have to excuse that I am not formally attired, right? We have been facing wildfires here in California
You have.
for some time. And even before I say that, I just also want to thank you, Ivan, and thank you all for making this event possible. We had planned to, have a little bit of family time, so I'm glad that you all are bearing with me as I join you from near Lagunitas Lake in California, which is sort of north of Oakland.
Okay.
And I think the question was just how I'm doing, and it's day by day. Some days we're crying, and some days we got yellow skies, but today there's blue skies and there's some clean air, and so we're trying to get out and be in nature a little bit. So I appreciate you all for bearing with me.
So let's get started. Can you discuss with the group why you wrote this book? It was so timely considering the environment that we are experiencing right now. And also, stories really dominate through your book. Why did you choose to use personal stories to bring issues to the forefront, starting with your own personal story?
My story intersects with Ivan's story. In 1995 we started, right, Ivan? Or 96?
95.
Thank you, 95. I'm terrible with dates. So I graduated summer 1995, then we were at Harvard fall 1995. Now, the thing that I learned later is that from 1991 to 1995 in California, youth crime was actually going down by about 20%, but the number of youth crime stories were going up by about 700% in terms of how often youth crime was being reported in the media. And this was a part of this, supposed youth super predator crime wave that never materialized, but it materialized in terms of media portrayal. It materialized in terms of how many youth prisons and jails were built during that time period. I found myself privileged, both being light-skinned African-American, and also going to Catholic school from K to 12. And so a lot of the inequities and structural racism, I was able to, in some ways, escape, found myself at Harvard. And that's when I started just to see how differently young people could be treated, often for doing some of the same things. So kids at Harvard using and abusing drugs, getting into fights and different things. But it was typically very clear that those students had a future ahead of them. They were given counseling. They were given the things that they needed to do well. Meanwhile, my family and friends were being locked up for doing similar things and losing years of their lives. And so that is kind of what led me to an interest in racial justice and economic justice, as well as seeing my mother, who was an elementary school teacher and really struggling with a lack of resources in her classroom. And so I heard about this organization called Books Not Bars. And that really resonated with my experience, that we needed to really invest in education and opportunity for young people rather than incarceration. And that was a program of the Ella Baker Center. I started off as a law school student intern, became an organizer, the director of a campaign, and eventually the executive director. So I joked that it was like that, Calvin from McDonald's commercial where he went from the fry cook to the manager of the McDonald's, but at a much better organization. And so the reason I wrote the book initially was actually because of a lot of momentum in the right direction. There was this sort of bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform. Everybody from Michelle Alexander all the way to Newt Gingrich were saying we have to address mass incarceration. And there was some groundswell around ending mass incarceration. And we had fought this campaign, which was really in line with ending mass incarceration. We said, hey, County of Alameda, local county, you're getting money from the state. The state is saying they're no longer going to accept people convicted of less serious offenses. So we're going to give 58 counties, including Alameda County, we're going to give you tens of millions of dollars to support these men and women who are convicted of less serious offenses. And so we thought this was a great opportunity to invest in community-based alternatives rather than jail, rather than sheriff, rather than the probation department. But most counties, including Alameda County, were just given all the resources to the sheriff and probation department. So we used, hip hop activism, we used poetry, we used, we used everything we could. We sat down and did a civil disobedience in the tradition of the civil rights movement. And we finally convinced them to move the resources in a different direction to community-based programs. So we thought that was a victory. But then what happened is that they gave a lot of the resources to the same nonprofits that promised to provide people with jobs, but only did job training, who promised to do restorative justice, but really didn't have a felt connection with the community. So part of the reason for this book was really to lift up, what do community safety solutions actually look like? How do we get there? Once you move the resources, that's one thing, but we actually need to invest in real community safety solutions. So that was the first reason I wrote the book. The second reason was because of Donald Trump, and seeing just how tied our notions of safety are to our democracy itself, right? Because if you can deny someone rehabilitation, if you can deny them an opportunity for a job after they are released from prison, then you can deny folks the franchise. If you can scapegoat entire communities through criminalization, then you can scapegoat entire political parties. If you can say that, welfare queens are cheats, then you can also say that the whole Democratic Party is a cheat and is going to cheat, right? And so this logic of us versus them ultimately doesn't end, it just expands until we say enough is enough. And I think people are finally saying enough is enough in a lot of different ways. And I hope that the book can be part of that groundswell of saying enough is enough. We demand racial equity, we demand racial justice, and we demand a real democracy in this country. And so some of the themes that I end on in the book really speak to these larger themes of democracy. The last thing I'll say is why I use stories is because I think it really is fundamental to changing hearts and minds. When you talked about our fight to close 5 youth prisons across the state of California. And mind you, when we closed those youth prisons, not only did human rights increase, but youth crime actually decreased during that same period. Because guess what? When you treat young people with dignity and with respect, and connect them to opportunity, they're going to do better. They're less likely to go back into the system. And so actually closing down youth prisons actually increased public safety. And so I say that because it's important. But when we first started that campaign, people said it wasn't possible. They said it couldn't be done. And we brought all the statistics, and, you know, it costs you $150,000 per year per young person. 3 out of 4 young people are being rearrested within a year. And that had some sway, but ultimately what was really important was mothers and grandmothers, young people themselves telling their own stories, mothers and grandmothers telling the story of driving 5 hours just to see their kids, only to be told they couldn't visit because they had on the wrong pair of pants, right? They had on a colored pair of pants that were not allowed, or their entire child's unit was on lockdown because of a fight. And they would have to turn around, sometimes having paid the cost of a hotel, having, you know, put so much money on to pay for gas. And telling those stories, I think, really helped disabuse and shift the mindset of legislators that these are the welfare queens and all of that, and really to help people understand these folks are trying desperately to support their children and grandchildren. And we started with passing legislation just to make it easier for families to stay in contact, but we were able to build on that and actually push for 5 youth prisons to be closed. And so I wanted to make sure in this book that we really focused on stories, because I hope that it'll help build the empathy that we really need in this country at this moment.
And it did. They were very effective. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And you gave a voice to those various communities, which goes back to this whole theme of inclusiveness. So you allow those people to speak in their own voices.
That's right.
Relating to their own problems and situations. When it comes to fighting for freedom, justice, and equality, we have so many people that you see in front of the scene and behind the scenes, people like yourself who are working hard, making sure that people are treated fairly and equally. And that brings me to a person that has been a part of the civil rights movement, someone where worked very hard. She was an organizer, just as you are, activist, believe in bringing communities together, and sort of using that same type of concept of this restorative justice. And that person is Ella Baker, the name of your center.
Yeah.
And I see her writing, I see that activism in your writing in your book. So you're continuing this legacy. So can you discuss Ella Baker as a warrior in a man's space and how her legacy inspires you? Can you give us a sense of who she was and how her life's work as an organizer and an activist is related to the mission of the Ella Baker Center?
Thank you for that question. And thank you for saying that, because we often say ourselves that we are trying to build upon the legacy of Ella Baker, who was a leader in the freedom struggle for decades, and the freedom struggle for Black folks and white folks and brown folks. She didn't suffer fools lightly, right? She was determined to be a leader, but to share leadership. And one of the things that she believed was that movements didn't need to be leader-centered, but rather leaders needed to be movement-centered, right? So she believed in leader-centered, in movement-centered leaders. And one of the ways in which she showed this was just through her organizing. She organized with students and sharecroppers alike across the South and beyond. She lived in New York for some time and really pulled in the wisdom and knowledge of so many folks. But she always led with an intention of distributing power. And one example of that was when students had started this, sit-in movement. And there was a lot of energy from all of the kind of mainstream civil rights organizations to say, hey, students, be a youth wing of our organization or this organization or that organization. And she was really emphatic in terms of saying, no, you all need to do your own convening and create something of your own. And that became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was just so instrumental in terms of moving the civil rights movement, but also creating a different ethos, because I think younger folks had a different sensibility around patriarchy and sexism. And so there was, not that it was perfect in that space either, but there was some more generative ideas around sharing leadership across gender within SNCC than I think in some of the longer in the Tooth civil rights organizations. And we're still fighting patriarchy. I talk about that in the book. I try to be an ally as a cisgendered man. But one of the things that I see is like, we have a society that will put all kinds of money behind military and punishment and prisons and things that are quote unquote masculine, and things that are seen as feminine, from healthcare to education to paying teachers to paying healthcare workers to providing, you look at how our police are armed with all of this protective gear and helmets and shields, and you see that nurses were putting themselves in literal trash bags to try to protect themselves from COVID. And it was just this perfect example and tragic example of our priorities and the way they need to shift. And so we have, through this Who Pays report, people can go to whopaysreport.org to see the impact of mass incarceration on Black women in particular. We have really tried to lift that up in our work, and I tried to lift it up in the book as well. So thank you for that question.
Sure, because the rise of women being incarcerated has went up, which is
absolutely the fastest growing.
Yes, indeed. And in terms of healthcare too, that's another problem, because Ella Baker suffered from Alzheimer's at the end, and died on the day that on her birthday.
December 13th.
Yeah, and I was so happy that the center was named after her. So I want to thank you for my questions. Now my co-facilitator, Carolyn.
Okay.
And some questions for you to ask.
The one thing that I would like to say is that I found, as I was reading your book, I found that it was predictive. I thought, wait a minute, is this prophetic? And I looked at the copyright. Was this written yesterday? That was my first thought. Did he write this yesterday? Because it's so relevant with what's going on in the country. So much has occurred since you were at the museum back in, I believe it was in March. So the legitimacy of all of our institutions and practices has they've all been challenged. Our concept of what makes us feel safe is different now as compared to just a year ago. And safety, fear is at the forefront of everybody's mind, including myself. And so can you discuss, your recommendations and how, if at all, your recommendations have changed since you wrote the book?
In the second half of the book really details 3 different people's stories, 3 different family stories, and tries to imagine stories that ended up in real life ending in some level of tragedy, how those tragedies might have been averted. And basically, it looks at, a different family, often beginning with young people in their teenage years and sort of what happened to them. And each time, this goes back to the distinction I drew between East Oakland and Harvard and how young people were treated, right? But we know what the solutions are that actually help young people, their families, adults. They're public health oriented. They are treating the root of the problem. They are providing, families with a means of sustaining themselves. They are providing young people with opportunities to be young people, right? I'm sitting here in nature and I'm reminded of the fact that in high school, I got to do a ropes course where I climbed these giant trees like these redwoods that you see behind me. And I jumped out and grabbed this, giant trapeze. And it was this amazing thing. And they all had me on belay and they had me on these like harnesses and things like that. But that's what young people need. They need opportunities to challenge their boundaries and to take risks, right? And young people will do that in different ways. And as adults, if we provide a safe space for them to do that, then they'll go on to do amazing things. And if we don't, then tragedy can ensue. And I think I believe that what we're seeing with COVID-19 is that we haven't invested in the infrastructure of public health, right? And that is so clear and it is so obvious. We always talked about we need public health solutions for public health issues from school discipline, mental health, drug use, homelessness, even violence. All of these different issues have public health responses. I never ever thought that I would need to say that you need to treat a global pandemic with a public health response, right? But leave it to this president to use that same playbook of scapegoating, of blaming, not taking responsibility, and saying, well, it's the fault of China, or more recently now, it's the fault of people in cities, right? And so he's using this same playbook, and I call it the "he keeps us safe" lie. Because it is an abusive lie. It is the lie of abusers. Abusers say, don't trust your girlfriend, don't trust your mom, only trust me, even while they're doing the dirt in the home. And he similarly says, don't trust your neighbors in China, don't trust your neighbors around the block, don't trust your neighbors across town, don't trust your neighbors at the border. All the while he's exacerbating and worsening inequality, climate change, structural racism, you name it, right? And so we have to reject that lie. We have to know that we keep us safe. And I think we have our work cut out for us, but I think that more and more people are really seeing the lie and exposing the lie.
In light of everything that's going on now, how do we keep ourselves safe now?
So I'm going to give you just a general overview of the framework for the book is that we need resources, we need participation, we need accountability, and we need relationship. And so we need to move away from a punishment framework where we isolate people and to actually use restorative justice to hold people accountable. We need to stop depriving communities of resources and actually bring resources in the form of good jobs to everybody, healthcare, etc. And I know these are big picture issues. So the things that I would focus on in the next, months between now and the inauguration are really building relationship and participation to hold this president accountable, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean, there is this opening now where I think all of us should be exploring each and every community that we're in, right? I've started to reach out to all of the folks who are in that Harvard 99 that Ivan referenced, some of whom I haven't been in contact with in a while, all of whom I know would rather have a democracy than not, right? And I believe that we really need to be rekindling those relationships. There is a booklet called Hold the Line around how we can be organizing to make sure that each and every vote is counted in this election, and participating in the political process, not just through voting or being poll workers, but also making sure that our county officials, our state officials, across the country are actually counting our votes, are certifying it, making sure that they send the right number of electoral college people to vote in our interests. And that's going to be our work from now all the way until the inauguration on January 21st. And that's the way that we hold this president accountable, because when you have, you know, one person who can be above the law, then the whole political party is above the law. And we already know the impacts of white supremacy. And so we have to honor Breonna Taylor, and we have to honor George Floyd, and we have to honor so many and John Lewis and so many other folks by organizing and really participating and engaging. I think that's the most important thing that we can do to keep us safe in this moment.
Here I am, Zach. How are you? Thank you so much for this book. I'm going to keep it real in the first part of the book. I love how you did the spectrum of harm, how you changed the word crime to harm, and then how you looked at this other painful part is the interpersonal harm. So that's the harm that we do to one another. When you talked about the child abuse and the sexual abuse and some of the things that are going on inside of our communities and how we heal that trauma and that pain. And I just want to thank you for mentioning that as a social worker, because that's my work, is try to heal from the trauma of some of the interpersonal things that we're going through. And I just want to know a little more, how do you think we deal with that piece?
One thing is that we have to set the culture from the top. And so if we have, you know, a president who embodies all of the worst of patriarchy, who gets away with these kinds of harms, then that really sets the tone. And the other thing that I would lift up is just some of the amazing work that Black women like Nia Wilson in Durham, North Carolina are leading, like Mariam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie in New York, and so many others who incite women of color against violence, who put out incredible works and who are doing the work in community to help keep people safe, and to do so in ways that try to avoid the rock and the hard place that women often find themselves in. I know of women in my family who haven't gotten a divorce because they're worried about their health care, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
And so we have to really challenge the violence overtly, but also challenge the structural violence that is a system that won't provide people with the basics, right? Eleanor Roosevelt fought for a second Bill of Rights that would have included housing and included the right to eat and things like that. And that's the direction I think we need to take in order to make families truly safe. I think there are other examples that I lift up in the book. PRISM, which is doing incredible work challenging sexual assault on campuses. I'm really proud that at our local community colleges, we actually got them to end their contract with the sheriff that was responsible for deportation, for police brutality on community college campuses. And now we're talking with them about different interventions, including challenging sexual violence, including challenging other forms of violence, but doing it through a way that, as you described, like holds people accountable, but still holds them in community.
I do have a comment here and a question. It says, your book should be required reading on Capitol Hill. All right. And how can you make that happen? It is usually all about the money, and it is also about fear.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for that compliment. I agree. I would love to see more elected officials reading the book and others. And it's starting to happen a little bit in the Bay Area. We had a book discussion guide similar to this one where one of our local city council members came and spoke and talked about how she made sure that all of her fellow city council members had the book. So I think it's starting here and there. I'm inspired by the work in Minneapolis and other places where people are really questioning the kind of logic and seeing a long history of racial injustice. I remember talking with you, Ivan, about I think you were saying it was yellow fever in Philadelphia and the treatment of Black folks in Philadelphia. Yes. And that was when, you know, COVID was just starting to happen, and to see these things repeating and recycling is just tragic. But I think I'm inspired by the fact that the solutions that are being proposed are starting to be more to the scale of the problems that we're seeing. And it's going to take a while to get there. But I think if we can be as determined as our ancestors are and were, if we can, you know, recognize the challenges that they faced, we'll know that we have it in us. We have the trauma in us, but we also have the resilience in us, right, to overcome this moment.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Alisa, but before I do so, I would just like to thank you for myself and for the entire group. And so keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Waiting for your next book, part 2, part 3.
Yes.
All right. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ivan.
To the other participants, let's start with thoughts about the book, or thoughts about, you know, what we just heard. The good, the bad, the ugly.
I did like the way the book was organized as far as giving program solutions. It brought out the skepticism in me, because in the first part, when he was dealing with trauma, as far as trauma in the brain, right? And then just because I think that we're not dealing with, in our community, especially at certain levels of how much the harm is really affecting the way we are becoming. The last point that I wanted to link up was on page 94, when he was raising about the statistics, I guess, of how people with higher incomes and college degrees are more involved in civic activities compared to those who have less income and are dealing with more inequalities, feel powerless. So the trauma on one side being affected by those who would go to prison because of, as he laid out, you know, right, living on, and then on the other side, the people who have higher income, who are able to participate within the civic or the electoral or the political process where resources are divided.
Yes.
If there's no relationship created between the two, then the resources needed to deal with the people who have the trauma, it just seems like it will never really reach down. The advocacy needed by people who actually are benefiting, and I'm looking at within the Black community, are the upper, and not just about prisons, but just about the condition of Black people, the inequality that Black people are living. So many, especially so many children are living. Is the advocacy as strong and the political participation is as strong as it should be? That was accentuated in the book for me.
This is Barbara. Years ago, when my husband and all his friends were living, and mind you, my husband was about 19 years older than I, they would sit around the table and they would talk about the same thing that Zach's book addresses. And I would sit back and wonder, what are you doing? What kind of action are you doing? And of course, it turned out to be not much action, but a lot of lip service. So what we see now are young people who are very active. However, my biggest problem is, and I was the one that raised the comment about money and fear and people who are the powers that be coming together with those individuals who do not have that power and coming to some kind of commonality, because we simply don't have it. So we're at a stalemate. I love the fact that Zach did a lot of research and showed programs that were working, but there's always that stop sign in the way. How can we overcome that? stop sign?
I think reimagining what as Zach put this whole notion of fear and harm and safety. So I think once we educate ourselves into that type of thinking, changing our thinking and building those communities together. So that takes time. That takes education. If you got a diverse,
take forever.
If you can hear me, you need to learn those other people within that community. So it's the core of what he's saying is building those relationships, and it takes work.
It takes work and time. And it's just so sad that he has this wonderful, wonderful paradigm for what could be. Do we have, in our lifetime, will this occur?
So Barbara,
and you know what? I'm not trying to be a cynic. I'm really not. I'm not trying to be a naysayer or anything, because I thought the book was wonderful. I believe that we know about patriarchy and we know about this paternalism, and you know, it came across on the ships. It came with, they brought it with them, and they have kept it going. And just that, what can we do? How can we mobilize and make some of these realities happen? And there have been bits and pieces that have happened in the school system where there started to be something called in-house suspensions, where they didn't send the kids out into the community. There used to be peer mediation. So, okay, peer mediation, you know, I can go on and on and on with little pieces of how this, there's a possibility of things happening. I just like to see them happen. And I know time.
Let me ask this question of the group, and it goes to one of the themes in the book, safety. And I know that for everyone, safety has a different meaning, and it changes depending upon, you know, what's going on in our environment. But in terms of now, at this very moment, you know, do you feel safe? What does safety feel like to you? How do you define safety right now? And what does it mean to you? And what ways do you feel unsafe right now?
I don't want any of these fools who don't wear masks coughing on me. Okay.
These concepts are really deep. This whole fear mongering, everything that's happening in our community, and he broke it down. On a personal level, I do have to unpack that.
Yeah.
I've been socialized, trained, learned the wrong thing, and constantly trying to unlearn what's been taught, right? Trying not to be fearful because I've been taught to be fearful. Media is coming at us. All those things that we talk about, like it's easy to say, oh, Trump is creating this thing, but it's been creating for years. And so this whole thing of being afraid of even your own people sometimes, of how you get brainwashed. If you see a young kid running, you're like, oh my God, what they running? I hope they ain't do nothing. Did they do something? Instead of looking at the other way of, no, it doesn't have to be crime related all the time. So it's so much unlearning and undoing that has to be done that I know people don't have time for, but this book helps you see, it points things out, but it's so much inner work that has to be done. It's just incredible. And I want to say one thing real quick. One thing I did do is my first time I ever done is I joined a community organization. It's called Men Who Care of Germantown. It's been operating for 12 years. So to be in something is the way I feel, Barbara, we can fight something. Being involved in something that's locally and seeing what it's doing and being a part of what it's doing right in your backyard can feel like empowering.
And that's the whole premise of Zach's book, getting involved in community. And it starts with you, me, and all of us. That's why he states, we keep us safe. He's put the onus of the responsibility on us. And to really, in some sense, decolonize your mind, change your thinking, and reimagine how you look at these concepts.
How are you keeping safe right now? And
lock my door.
Lock your door? Did you say lock your door?
And the deadlock.
I don't know if this is a male thing on my part. It's interesting because I'm one who gave up television and commercial media a long time ago. So when I hear people being so inundated to the projection, say now it's the Trump, before it was the Bush or before it was the war in Iraq or, 9/11, being so inundated with that. I found myself in this 6 months of being in lockdown saying and going out saying that I have a certain risk level. I'm looking at the risk level where I hear some people have a high risk level, which means that they're not coming out at all. They're not doing in relationship to keeping themselves safe. They're not doing anything. And then there's other people, and when I go past the avenue, at first, their risk level was low. No mask, no glove. Now, I mean, they'll be out there, they created a tent, they're gambling on the street. So obviously for them, the risk level is low. From a safety perspective, for me, it was just a matter of the amount of risk that I'm willing to take.
Okay, so not being bombarded with media on a daily basis, do you think that made a difference because you don't have TV?
Definitely. One, I'm not doing what my grandmother and mother did, was holler, yell, scream at the television, because I don't have one. From that vantage point, which I'm only speaking to the impact it must have when you're actually focused, engaged. Now, that's not saying that I'm not Facebook and with my phone, but
you're
being
making it up
with this here medium that constantly is pushing this same message of either he is the boogeyman or he isn't the boogeyman. I'm not having that. I think that is one instance over the years that has relieved me. But the other thing is that I find in this moment that it made me more sensitive, especially around the political thing, electoral politics. I sensitize the group urgency, and I'm responding to that. I think this moment about Trump, I've heard more, even more than the COVID. People are more afraid about Trump, and I can't figure out, is that because of the media or is that because of the political engagement, which we're not engaged enough in?
I think it's both. It's both. I want to ask the group, what do you think about restorative justice as a healing component to bring communities together? Have you heard of this concept of restorative justice? And what context have you heard of it? Because not everybody has heard about it. And some people might have heard it through what was going on in South Africa or whatever. So what are your thoughts on this whole notion of restorative justice?
This is Ivan. I've definitely heard of it, and I don't know of any strong examples in this country. To me, it sounds powerful, and I have seen some re-entry programs. I mean, I shouldn't say I haven't heard of it. My brother is a product of restorative justice programs, but I haven't seen a lot. I think there's a big gap between theory and practice. We can learn from other places, but not all places have the special mix of opposed groups and hatred that we have here. One of the things that Zach is really getting at is going from an they and them mentality to an us and we mentality. And I don't think we will even try to implement any restorative justice programs writ large until we see more we and those folks who have done the harm.
Yes, agree with you, Ivan. I totally agree with you. I think they use some parts of that in South Africa. And as a result, they really didn't get a lot of reconciliation or heal inside as well as internally and externally, is because the same problems still prevail. And the same thing here, as you were saying, if we have to tackle the root of racism, because that is systemic and that's the root of our problems.
I have seen it, in the prison setting where there's an attempt to bring the victim and the perpetrator together in order to facilitate some level of healing. But it has to be a situation where the victim wants to participate. And so, there is a movement, to make it more popular and more mainstream than it is now. But still a lot of work to do.
It's a good concept. I agree with you.
I attended a 2.5-day training on it.
I was going to ask you.
The Metropolitan Christian Council of Philadelphia. And so before you get to restorative justice, they talked about restorative practice. So practicing relationships, practicing building relationships.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So that's really what he wants you to do. Communities to start building relationships and practice doing that. And that's the restorative justice is just one part of restorative practice altogether. So they doing that in schools and they're forming circles. So kids, you know, it's almost like peer mediation, but there's certain questions that ask. So you can start that kind of thought process now inside the schools. And then we have Black folks facilitating it because usually the trainers are white. So seeing these Black folks from the church, and I mean, it was so phenomenal, very professional. They were educated and qualified, but they brought in how we heal, how we deal with story, our music, our song, our dance, our imagery is part of the way to teach us how to start restorative circles. So it's on the move, and I feel like it's going to be more colored by how we as a people are.
And I think it goes back to what Zach is saying. You have to build those communities. And that's one of the core thing. You have to build those communities. So when you have this practices, everybody is you know, on the same boat with it. I
first heard it, or it kind of developed, was one out of the reparations movement, right? Restorative justice and that. And then Haranga and the Husea. And I just wanted, in the concept in which, as I hear us talk about it, because it seems that we can do practice, but if our values and ethics are not right, as being restorative, having restorative values and restorative ethics, our practice is just doing something that we really don't have no basis for. And and one thing that I liked in Kawaida in the Siruj, which was, you know, one of the principles of ancient Kemet, it says to rise up that which is in ruin, to repair that which is in damage, to rejoin that which is severed, to replenish that which is depleted, to strengthen that which is weakened, to set right that which is wrong, and to make flourish that which is insecure and underdeveloped. Now, if we can't, those are principles, and if we don't, you know, have those principles that line up with behavior, I'm not an advocate of reforming this. You know, because that's like just cutting around the edges. This either you have to become something new, or it has to transform totally. And in this society and in this structure as it is not about restorative justice. It isn't about making something, bringing ruins or repairing damages or rejoining something severe or depleted. It isn't about that. It's about exploiting, and therefore it creates trauma, and it creates trauma, it creates harm, and it creates harm, and it perpetuates that. And when it finishes that, it throws it away and say next.
Right.
And it's an old it's, you know, the name has changed, but the concept is historical, and Zach talks about that in the book, how communities used to sustain themselves through this same restorative context. You know, this restorative healing. It's an old idea. It's just as we go along, we tend to recycle. Recycle the concept, but the names change. But the meaning and what has happened, what has went before is still the same.
There was a time when people didn't have to lock their doors, you know, because everybody took care of everybody. Richard, thank you. I'm going to go dust off my Husea.
Yes, it's a good book. I'd recommend it.
I'm going to pull it out of the bookcase and look at it.
This is Michael Clemens. I don't think restorative justice is the kind of thing that's going to be successful on a mass scale.
Okay.
But I do believe with regard to individuals, it can be very successful. So that goes for in this country as well as the program it had in South Africa. I had actually heard the woman who had been very involved in the program in South Africa, the Reconciliation Committee, and she ended up being on the Supreme Court. She spoke at Penn earlier this year. And she herself said, you know, there's more to it than that. But I think it's another tool that we have that can help some people have some return to normalcy or some degree of healing. And I think we have to look at it from that perspective.
Thanks for sharing, Michael.
Yeah. The beloved community, Dr. King.
Well, thank you everyone so much. This was such a great first round of our book club. Yes, yes, claps all around. Special thank you, of course, to Alisa and Carolyn. Please take care, please be safe, and we keep us safe. So we'll see you all next month.
Okay. Asante sana.
All right.
Bye-bye.